Hi, welcome back. In this chapter, we're going to look at getting set up and connected. What we're not going to do is go through the e-licenser and registration process step by step. There's a whole pile of really well done factory videos out there already that cover that stuff. We're going to look at a little deeper understanding of why the connection screens are the way they are and some tricks to use to not only speed up your initial setup, but troubleshooting on down the road. Now, one thing you've already discovered is as soon as you start a new project, the first thing you see is the Steinberg hub. And a lot of people get high-centered on the fact that it doesn't seem to want to let you just start recording. It stops you at this stage before anything can happen and says, well, wait a minute, where are we going to save this material? And that, to a lot of folks, seems like an afterthought, but we're going to, in just a couple of minutes, I think you'll understand exactly why this is a critical first step. And it ties into a whole bunch of other stuff on down the road with backing up and moving and, those times when you find missing elements to your project later and so forth. So we're going to, here we're starting I'm just going to create a blank one, and I'll throw it in the default location to keep things moving along here. But in this chapter, my primary goal is to get you through what I like to call the vocabulary barrier, because there are a couple of terms that if you're new to Cubase are just flat out confusing. And if you're already familiar with Cubase, it can be confusing because Steinberg now uses them in different ways in different places. And the two big ones I want to try and drill down on are this word right here, devices, particularly the difference between how it's used in this menu and in this pop-up, and then the way they use MIDI, and then the next level below that, ASIO and VST. So let's jump in with devices. When you open this drop-down menu, and by the way, if you come down here to the panel, this gives you a quick access push button way to turn on and off all of the things that appear in this list. So if you're coming up here all the time to say turn your time display on and off, it may be easier just to float this panel, and then you can call all this stuff up and put it away just with the click of a button. It's exactly the same set of stuff. But in any case, all of the things listed on this drop-down menu, all of these devices are virtual. They're inside the computer. It's not a real piece of hardware. I guess the exception would be the Steinberg 121 interface, but everything else in here is new. That's fundamentally different from device, the word device as it's used in this panel, and this is reference to all of your external hardware, and you'll see that the 121 is mentioned here as well. And this is key because a long time ago, this menu, the devices menu, had a different name. It was tools or something like that. So that the word device had a very specific connotation of hardware. So you need to get clear on that. This menu, if you ever have setup or connection problems, this menu right here, the device setup menu, is probably where the problems or the magic are going to happen, whether it's working or not. And of all the things on here, probably the most important is this VST audio system, because that's where you're going to pick out your new, where your system is getting its sound stream or its audio stream from. And by the way, anybody who's using a Mac with the El Capitan or later operating system, you will notice this AirPlay glitch. I don't know if they're eventually going to come up with a fix for this or not, but it now has a penchant for defaulting to AirPlay as your ASIO driver all the time. We're going to switch this over to our external. In just a minute, we'll come back and go through what all the particulars are. But this use of the word device is fundamentally different than what you find on the menu up at the top of the screen. The other thing that's key is that this screen, the device setup screen, is where you're going to get to configure the MIDI hardware connection into Cubase. And the reason I want to point that out is because you get set up and rolling on down the road, eventually you'll have some sort of a hang up with MIDI, and it's completely understandable to look under the MIDI menu to try and find that. And you're scrolling through here going, well, wait a minute, I want to fix my whatever it is, whether it's a USB MIDI device or a rack-mounted thing, and you can get just incredibly frustrated pawing through this menu trying to get to your MIDI device when it's actually hiding over here. So that's one thing to keep straight as you're going forward, is that the use of the word devices as it pertains to setup is the hardware stuff found there in that menu. Now, the other terms that are key, especially if you're a relatively new user, are keeping straight what's VST and what's ASIO. Let me shift gears here for just a moment. Okay, so once you're in that device setup menu that we were just looking at, let's talk about what the component pieces in there really mean. So at the center of all this, you've got your computer running Cubase, and everything I'm doing is on a Mac, but this same basic theory applies to Windows as well. The two key pieces of external hardware you'll need are some sort of audio interface, and then this is going to be your go-between for signal to and from the computer, and then, of course, the other side of it, you're going to plug in guitars and mics and speakers and stuff. Then you'll have a MIDI interface device as well, and again, you access those two in that device setup window, and your MIDI interface is what's going to get keyboard signal or drum pad in and out. And any more with as many controllers being USB as there are, it's conceivable you might not have an external piece of hardware for that. You might plug, say, a USB mic or a USB keyboard right into the back of the computer, in which case that mic or keyboard or whatever itself is going to be your interface device, and you're going to configure it in that same window we were just looking at. Now, I want to drill down on this orange double-headed arrow a little bit because that's fairly vital. The link between your hardware interface and your computer is everything. That is how the audio streams in and out. And this term ASIO, sometimes pronounced as SEO, but I think the proper pronunciation is ASIO, stands for audio stream input output. And again, keep those last two in mind. Input output means we're talking about an external piece of hardware. And this audio stream is everything. That's the lifeblood of your recording setup. So if you want fully professional results from Cubase, you need to connect it using an interface device that's also very high caliber and so forth. All right. Looking at that stream in even more detail, this is key. As the signal comes into your interface, of course, it's converted to digital. That's its whole purpose in life. And then Cubase streams it directly to your hard drive in real time. And this is why the computer or the program, rather, the application will stop and ask you at the very outset, where are we going to save this? Because it's not going to buffer that. It's going to send it right to hard disk, direct to disk recording. And that's got two advantages. First is it keeps the memory requirements down so that you don't need a Cray supercomputer to do this. But second of all, remember all of your editing in Cubase is non-destructive, and this is why no matter what you do to stuff, clipping, cutting, pasting, editing, and so forth, you can always back out and get to the original sound file and start again. And this is why. So this has real benefits for memory utilization, of course, but also it's sort of at the heart of the non-destructive recording process. But this is why that initial dialogue always pops up before you do anything else. Cubase wants to know where we're going to store this program. And what it's really asking is, where am I going to put the audio folder? And in a couple of chapters, when we look at folder architecture and how what a Cubase project really consists of, all the component parts, you'll see that's sort of the behemoth. That's where most of the good stuff lives, so to speak. Now, the other key term that you run across all the time is VST, which stands for Virtual Studio Technology. And this is a computer language that Steinberg invented that allows the stuff inside the computer to act as if it were a real hardware studio. But the key is, in ASIO, whenever you're having a dialogue pops up or a problem pops up that's related to ASIO, it's that I/O. It's an input-output problem, so you're going to be looking at hardware. Anytime you have a VST connection issue, or you want to do something more elaborate with VST, you're working inside. It's virtual stuff. And the VST connections and the VST technology is what allows you to take several inputs and tracks and set up buses, and then say route one track or one input to track 2 over to an effects bus to the output bus and so forth, and then turn right around and take output 4, track 6, skip the effects bus, all this stuff. All of this internal wiring and rewiring, what would be the virtual equivalent of the old patch bay with the cables, that's all VST. And that means anytime you have an issue with that, you're going to be looking at stuff inside the program itself, not loose cords and bad drivers and things of that nature. It's also worth noting that the more elaborate your VST connections become and the more effects and so forth you're throwing at your signal, the longer it takes the computer to do that. And that can introduce latency, which we'll look at here in just a second. Latency just means a delay introduced by the processing, the digital processing. Okay, so now with that in mind, if we come into the device menu down to device setup, then we can look at the VST audio system itself. And there are two windows to this. The highest layer, the VST audio system, is where you're going to pick out your actual driver, what device you want. Now, in my case here, we have this Steinberg interface in the rack, and then I occasionally will use the built-in audio. But if you had multiple interfaces, they'd all show up there. The release driver in background just means if you're bouncing around using different programs simultaneously, whenever Cubase is not in focus, it'll turn loose of that and let another program use it. The ASIO guard down here you'll see is a relatively new feature, and basically ASIO guard doing exactly what its name implies. It's watchdogging that audio stream, and all other factors being equal, leave that turned on. And what it's going to do is, whenever possible, it's going to pre-calculate as much as it can, so that there's less burden on the actual interface during recording and playback. So if you have a virtual synthesizer part, for example, it can look ahead and sort of pre-package all of that sound so that it's not trying to do it in real time. It leaves more of your processor horsepower free to do the real-time calculations on the audio stream. Then if we come down here to the second layer, so whatever you set here, let's change this just real quick to built-in audio, right? And then I come down here and I have controls for the built-in audio device. If I go back to VST, change it back to the FireWire driver, to my Steinberg unit, then you can see this becomes much more elaborate. This is where you're kind of actually talking to your external hardware device, and you can name all of your ports appropriately. So in this case, my first hardware input, and I can't adjust this, that's fixed by the device, but I can come over here and say I'd like that to show up in the world of Cubase as my Shure SM7 booth mic, and so forth. So you can give every hardware input in your system a common sense name within the program. Makes it a lot easier to move around and keep track of what you're connecting to and where it's coming from and so forth. So in this case, we have 8 analog inputs. We've got several light pipe inputs and then some SPDIF stuff going on. And I've chosen to leave these named for their actual hardware ports, but that's because of how we're using the system in the background here. So you can go through and give everything a specific name. And I recommend doing that because it's going to make the process of connecting to all of your tracks and different areas inside the program a lot more intuitive. You don't have to keep track of what's plugged into port 7 or port 16. Then this is something else that's absolutely vital and very easy to miss. In the world of digital stuff, anytime you're connecting two digital machines together, the clock source is everything. Unless the clocks are running perfectly in sync, nothing else can happen. So very often when people run into you get an email or a question that says my blank isn't working, 50% of the time it's a clock problem. And this is, again, if we're talking about an ASIO thing, that means interface, that means external hardware. You're going to come in here. If you're just flat out troubleshooting, check the clock source first, because that can be a vital. If that's not right, nothing else is going to work. We'll put it that way. And then the last thing I want to call your attention to is this direct monitoring. That's not going to be available 100% of the time. Only certain audio interfaces support direct monitoring, but if they do, you should use this, because direct monitoring is going to allow the incoming signal to make a 180. It kind of splits it. Part of it comes into the computer for recording, and then part of it gets sent right back out so that the performer under headphones, whether that's you or someone in a booth, is going to be able to hear their signal with absolutely no latency, none whatsoever, because their signal that they're hearing doesn't even pass through the computer. So this is going to give you a much nicer recording experience if you have the option. And I would say if you're shopping for an interface, that's one thing to put on your wish list is direct monitoring capability. Now, all of that being said, let's, well, click too soon. The one other thing I want to point out here on your MIDI setup port is the option for visible and all MIDI in. Stretch this over just a little bit. This last column, all MIDI inputs, I would say start with those clicked, start with those turned on so that nothing's getting rejected until you settle in and your system's working the way it wants. If you find strange things happening, like the reason I have that disabled is this CC121, it's a remote hardware control surface. If I have that turned on, anytime I manipulate a control on it, it sends that MIDI data to the entire system. So if I have a synthesizer hooked up and I move the fader, it'll start generating random notes and so forth. So that one I've intentionally filtered out to keep its data stream necked down a little bit. But when you're first setting up, make sure that all MIDI inputs are turned on until you've got signal flowing everywhere that you want it. Now let's move from all of this device-related stuff so instead of the device panel, we're going to come up a few to VST connections. And I'll point out that F4, your function 4, is going to call that up automatically whenever possible. If you know the speed keys for things, it's going to make stuff even faster. And as I'm sure you've already figured out, you've got, again, nested tabs along the top to set up your input and output busing. So if we want to add a VST connection, we can simply click Add Bus. Let's say we want to add one mono bus, and we're going to name this booth 2, and add bus. Now here's where, if I open it, so I have the bus name, which speaker configuration, which device it's using. I guess I could go ahead and connect that to the FireWire device. But in this case, you can see that the device port name that we gave it previously, this is where it pops up. So if I had taken the time to go through and name everything in the device setup menu, now those names would be here to work with. The only one that we did was that Shure SM7 booth mic. But as I'm configuring things, this is where you see the common sense name or the common name pop up and just makes it easier to get around. And of course, you've got, at the moment, we have a very basic output bus here, but this is where you would come in if you happen to have say a 5.1 monitor system. You're going to add that, and then you could pick out all of these would have names like left center, right center, the big subwoofer, whatever, and you can connect them appropriately. The most important thing, what I want to stress here is with your input and output buses, because a lot of the effects, external stuff in studio, those are for an advanced course we'll look at later. The key is, once you have this configured the way you want it, is to go ahead and create a preset. I'll just call this my default. And once that's saved as a configuration, if your system crashes, or if you do an operating system update, or you get a new bunch of hardware, whatever it is, and all of this resets. Now, what we're looking at here is fairly simple. It'll be easy to go in and do manually. But if you have a real elaborate setup, and for whatever reason that kicks out, you do an upgrade to Cubase itself, and that for some reason doesn't come back. If you've got your presets set here, you can very quickly go in and set it right back up, and you can see that that they've configured a bunch of pretty usable standard stuff in here for you. If you go, I'd like a 5.1 setup, it's going to have that, and contained down in there is going to be your default, which we just did. So I would say for your input and output, fairly critical to save those presets. Well, not critical. It's going to save you a lot of headache and time later if things go sideways and you lose your connections. And really, I guess the last thing that I want to point out here is that for when you're doing your initial setup, you're going to be asked repeatedly to register the software. And in years past, registration was more of a housekeeping task. But today, especially when we get to the collaboration tools, you're going to see that having your software properly registered with Steinberg is vital. Not just if you have to call in a support ticket, but none of the collaboration tools are going to work right unless you're registered. And a lot of the the patches and the updates that come out, as well as the content and access to the forum and everything else, All of that requires registration. So as you're setting your system up, and you keep getting that dialog that pops up that says, please register, just take 2 minutes and go do that, because the stuff we're going to look at here in just a little bit won't work right if you don't. So I hope that gets you off to the races. We're going to leave it there on the setup stuff, and we'll pick it back up here in the next chapter with looking at the major components and the interactions between them throughout the system.